On the morning of August 5th, 1962, America woke up to a headline that seemed impossible. Marilyn Monroe was dead. She was only 36 years old. Within hours, newspaper presses were running around the clock. Radio stations interrupted their regular programming. Television anchors looked directly into their cameras and delivered the news with visible disbelief. Outside a quiet house in Brentwood, reporters gathered behind police lines. Fans arrived carrying flowers. Some stood in complete silence. Others simply cried. The brightest star in Hollywood was gone. But the story that shocked the world did not begin that Sunday morning. It began 48 hours earlier, when Marilyn Monroe was still alive, still making plans, still answering phone calls, still believing there would be another tomorrow. That is what makes this story so heartbreaking. History often remembers the exact moment someone dies. It rarely remembers how they were living just before. For more than 60 years, Marilyn Monroe's final weekend has been examined by journalists, historians, investigators, and millions of people around the world. Hundreds of articles have been written, countless documentaries have been produced. Questions have been asked again and again. Yet behind every headline, behind every photograph, behind every theory, there was a real woman. Not the Hollywood icon, not the international sex symbol, not the face that appeared on magazine covers across the world. Just a woman who had spent her entire life searching for something fame could never give her: peace. Before we step inside that house, before we follow the final 48 hours, you need to understand one thing. The woman the world called Marilyn Monroe, and the woman who looked back at herself in the mirror every morning, were not always the same person. Hollywood created Marilyn Monroe, but long before Hollywood, there was Norma Jean, a little girl who never experienced the kind of childhood most people take for granted. She grew up moving between foster homes. She knew loneliness long before she knew fame. She learned how quickly people could disappear from your life. Perhaps that is why, even after becoming one of the most recognized women on earth, she continued searching for something far more valuable than celebrity. She wanted stability. She wanted love. She wanted a family. Those dreams stayed with her for the rest of her life. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe had already achieved what almost every actor dreams of. Her films had reached audiences around the world. Her image had become one of the most recognizable in modern culture. Photographers followed her everywhere. Every smile became tomorrow's headline. To millions of people, she seemed untouchable. But photographs only capture a fraction of a second. They never reveal what happens after the cameras stop. Behind the scenes, the previous months had been difficult. Her health had become increasingly fragile. Her production work on Something's Got to Give had been interrupted. Newspapers focused on controversy. Rumors spread faster than facts. Many people assumed her career was coming to an end. But history tells a more complicated story. In the days before her death, conversations about returning to the unfinished film were taking place. Future work was still being discussed. People close to Marilyn later described moments when she sounded hopeful. Not because everything was perfect, but because she believed she still had time. That single detail changes everything. Because when we look back at the final 48 hours, we are not watching someone who knew the end was near. We are watching someone who was still planning a future. And perhaps that is the most tragic part of this story. Friday morning, August 3rd. California greeted the day with bright skies and warm summer air. The quiet neighborhood of Brentwood looked exactly as it always had. Children played outside. Cars rolled slowly through tree-lined streets. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing suggested that one ordinary weekend would become part of Hollywood history forever. Inside her home on 5th Helena Drive, Marilyn Monroe woke up. She had phone calls to return, people to speak with, plans to discuss, appointments that still mattered. The future still existed. At least, that is what everyone believed. No reporters stood outside the gates, no police cars waited nearby. No one could see what history already could. The clock had quietly begun counting down, and with every passing hour, Marilyn Monroe moved one step closer to becoming a legend, not because of the life she had lived, but because of the final 48 hours the world would never stop trying to understand. And it all began with what seemed like an ordinary Friday morning. The morning unfolded quietly. Marilyn spent time inside her Brentwood home, a place she had purchased only months earlier. Unlike the glamorous mansions often associated with Hollywood stars, this house was private, peaceful, and carefully chosen. Friends later recalled that she wanted it to feel like a real home, not a symbol of fame. For someone who had spent so much of her life surrounded by cameras, privacy had become a luxury. That Friday, life appeared remarkably ordinary. She spoke with people connected to her personal and professional life. She discussed future plans. There were conversations about work. Nothing in those documented moments suggested that history was only hours away. That is what makes the timeline so haunting. When we know how a story ends, every ordinary moment suddenly feels different. A simple phone call becomes unforgettable. A casual conversation becomes the last. A quiet afternoon becomes part of history. As the day moved forward, Marilyn continued looking ahead. There were still unfinished projects. There were still professional opportunities. 20th Century Fox had begun discussing her return after the production difficulties surrounding Something's Got to Give. Those conversations mattered because they showed something many headlines ignored. Marilyn's career was not simply ending. They were genuine efforts to move forward. People close to her later described moments of optimism, not overwhelming happiness, not a perfect life, but hope. And sometimes, hope is far more fragile than people realize. Outside her home, Los Angeles carried on without pause. Traffic flowed through the city. Tourists visited Hollywood Boulevard. Movie studios continued filming. Thousands of people walked past giant posters featuring actors whose names would soon be forgotten. But one name had already become timeless: Marilyn Monroe. She had spent years becoming a symbol. The world admired the image. Very few understood the person living behind it. As afternoon slowly turned into evening, the golden California sunlight began to fade. Long shadows stretched across the garden. The air grew quieter. Inside the house, the pace of the day slowed. There were no photographers waiting outside the gates, no television cameras, no flashing lights. For perhaps the first time in years, one of the most recognizable women on earth was almost completely alone with her thoughts. History rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with warning sirens. It often hides inside ordinary moments. A normal conversation, a peaceful sunset, a quiet house. No one, not her neighbors, not her friends, not even Marilyn herself, could have known that these simple hours would later be examined by investigators, journalists, historians, and millions of people around the world. Every phone call, every visitor, every reported movement, every minute. The final 48 hours would become one of the most carefully reconstructed timelines in Hollywood history. But that Friday was not over yet. As daylight disappeared beyond the trees surrounding 5th Helena Drive, another evening quietly settled over Brentwood. The lights inside Marilyn's home began to glow against the darkening sky. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. No one passing that house would have stopped. No one would have guessed that by the end of the weekend, those same streets would be filled with police officers, reporters, photographers, and grieving fans. Because sometimes, the biggest tragedies begin on days that feel completely ordinary. And as Friday night approached, the countdown continued. Unseen, unheard, unstoppable. In the next chapter, Friday night would come to an end, and the final 24 hours of Marilyn Monroe's life would begin. Night settled gently over Brentwood. The warm California sky slowly faded into darkness. Inside Marilyn's home, the world had become quiet. There were no movie cameras, no photographers calling her name, no crowds waiting outside the gate. For a woman who had spent years living beneath the brightest lights in Hollywood, the silence was almost impossible to imagine. Yet this was how she often spent her evenings, away from the spotlight, away from the image the world had created. Behind every famous photograph was a woman who valued moments of peace far more than people realized. That Friday night passed without attracting attention. No newspaper reported anything unusual. No one believed history was unfolding. For everyone outside that house, it was simply another summer evening in Los Angeles. But history has a strange habit. It hides its most important moments inside ordinary days. Only later do people realize they were standing at the edge of something that would never be forgotten. Looking back now, it is tempting to search for signs. To believe someone should have noticed something. To imagine there was a warning. But the documented record tells a different story. The final 48 hours did not begin with panic. They began with routine, with conversations, with plans, with a woman who, despite the challenges she had faced, was still living her life one day at a time. That is why this story remains so powerful. It reminds us that history is not written only in dramatic moments. Sometimes it is written in quiet ones. As midnight drew closer, the first day of those final 48 hours came to an end. The clock continued to move, hour by hour, minute by minute. No one knew that only one more day remained, one more sunrise, one more afternoon, one more evening. The world still believed Marilyn Monroe had time. She believed it too. But time was running out, and the most important day of this story had not even begun. Tomorrow would be Saturday, August 4th, 1962. It would be the last full day of Marilyn Monroe's life. And every conversation, every visitor, every phone call would soon become part of history. Saturday, August 4th, 1962. For millions of Americans, it was just another warm summer weekend. For Marilyn Monroe, it would become the final full day of her life. The strange thing about history is that it almost never feels historic while it is happening. There were no warning signs hanging over Brentwood. No newspaper predicted tragedy. No neighbor looked toward Marilyn's house and sensed that before another sunrise, one of Hollywood's greatest legends would be gone. The world simply kept moving, and so did Marilyn. When daylight filled the rooms of her quiet home on 5th Helena Drive, she woke to what appeared to be another ordinary California morning. The sunlight spilled through the windows. Birds could be heard outside. The neighborhood was peaceful. Nothing seemed different. Nothing seemed unusual. That is what makes this day so heartbreaking, because every ordinary moment would soon become extraordinary. Every conversation would become evidence. Every phone call would become history. Every hour would be examined for decades. Marilyn remained at home throughout much of the day. The house she had purchased only months earlier had become something she had searched for most of her life. Not another Hollywood mansion, not another symbol of success. A home. A place where she hoped she could finally feel safe. People often remember Marilyn Monroe as the woman surrounded by cameras. But during these final hours, there were no cameras, only silence. As the morning continued, Marilyn stayed in contact with people connected to both her personal life and her career. She answered calls, she made calls. There were conversations about work, conversations about the future. Nothing suggested that anyone believed these would become her final recorded interactions. That detail matters, because history is often rewritten by hindsight. Looking backward, every word feels important. But in that moment, they were simply ordinary conversations between people expecting tomorrow to arrive. One of the greatest myths surrounding Marilyn Monroe is that her final days were filled only with despair. The historical record tells a more complicated story. The previous months had certainly been difficult. Her health had struggled. The production of Something's Got to Give had been interrupted. Her name appeared constantly in newspaper headlines. But behind those headlines, important changes were taking place. 20th Century Fox had reopened discussions about bringing her back to complete the film. Future projects had not disappeared. Her career had not simply ended. There were still possibilities. People close to Marilyn later described moments in which she sounded hopeful, not because every problem had been solved, but because she believed another chapter of her life was still waiting to be written. That hope gives these final hours an entirely different meaning. She was not living as though the story had already ended. She was still looking forward. Outside her home, Los Angeles carried on without interruption. Tourists wandered through Hollywood. Families spent the afternoon together. Movie theaters prepared for evening audiences. Traffic rolled beneath the California sun. The city that had made Marilyn Monroe famous continued exactly as it always had. It had no idea it was living through the final day of one of its greatest icons. As afternoon slowly became evening, another important conversation entered the historical record. Actor Peter Lawford telephoned Marilyn. The two had known one another for years. According to Lawford's later account, Marilyn's voice sounded unusually quiet. Their conversation did not last long. Before hanging up, she reportedly said words that would be repeated around the world for decades.
Say goodbye to Pat. Say goodbye to the president. And say goodbye to yourself. Because you're a nice guy. Those words have been discussed ever since. Historians have offered different interpretations. Some believe they reflected emotional exhaustion. Others argue they have been misunderstood over time. The truth is simple. No one can know exactly what Marilyn intended. Only she knew the meaning behind those final words. What cannot be disputed is that this became one of the last documented conversations of her life. As evening settled over Brentwood, the atmosphere inside the house grew even quieter. Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, remained at the residence. Earlier that day, psychiatrist Dr. Ralph Greenson had visited Marilyn before leaving later in the evening, according to documented accounts. Afterward, the house became still. Outside, streetlights slowly came to life. Inside, lights continued glowing through the windows. From the sidewalk,
Everything appeared perfectly normal. No police officers, no reporters, no flashing cameras. Nothing that suggested the world was only hours away from receiving shocking news. History almost never announces itself. It whispers. It hides inside moments so ordinary that nobody notices them until they are gone. A ringing telephone, a closing door, a light left on in a quiet room. As the hours passed, Brentwood slowly fell asleep. The streets became empty.
The traffic faded into the distance. The night air settled over the neighborhood. Inside Marilyn's home, silence grew heavier with every passing hour. The woman whose face had appeared on thousands of magazine covers, the woman who had made millions laugh, the woman the world believed it knew, was now completely alone. She could not have known that, by sunrise, her home would be surrounded by reporters. She could not have known that police investigators would soon reconstruct every hour of this night.
She could not have known that millions of people, decades later, would still be trying to understand these final moments. Because to Marilyn, this was simply another Saturday night. Or at least, that is how it seemed. But somewhere between the fading light of that California evening and the first light of the coming dawn, history quietly changed forever. When the sun rose again, Marilyn Monroe would no longer be alive. The night grew deeper. The sounds of Los Angeles slowly disappeared into the distance. Street after street fell silent. Inside Marilyn's Brentwood home, very little movement could be seen from outside. The lights remained on, the curtains stayed closed. From the street, it looked like any other quiet home at the end of a summer evening. No one walking past could have imagined that this ordinary house would soon become one of the most photographed locations in America. As the hours passed, the documented timeline became increasingly difficult to reconstruct with complete certainty. Some events are supported by official records. Others rely on later recollections from the people who were there. Historians continue to compare those accounts, and not every detail has been interpreted the same way. But one fact is beyond dispute. As Saturday night moved toward Sunday morning, Marilyn Monroe was alive inside her home, and no one outside those walls knew they were witnessing the final hours of her life. For decades, investigators have carefully studied the people who were closest to Marilyn during those last hours, not because they were searching for a dramatic story, but because every final day leaves behind unanswered questions. Every life does. The people around Marilyn later found themselves remembering small details they might otherwise have forgotten. A conversation, a passing remark, a light left on, a closed bedroom door. Things that seemed ordinary in the moment, but became unforgettable after the tragedy. History has a way of giving ordinary memories extraordinary weight. As midnight approached, Brentwood had become almost completely still. The warm California air drifted through the trees. The streets were nearly empty. A few distant headlights crossed the neighborhood before disappearing into the darkness. Inside the house, nothing appeared unusual from the outside. No raised voices, no signs of panic, only silence. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of Marilyn Monroe's final night. There was no dramatic ending, no audience, no cameras recording history. Just a quiet home, and a woman the entire world believed it knew. But fame can be strangely deceptive. Millions recognized Marilyn's face. Very few truly understood the person behind it. They saw confidence. She often felt uncertainty. They saw glamour. She longed for peace. They saw an icon. She remained a human being, carrying hopes, disappointments, and dreams that had never completely disappeared. As the first hours of Sunday slowly arrived, the city around her continued sleeping. No newspaper had printed the story yet. No reporter had received a phone call. No fan had placed flowers outside her gate. The world was only a few hours away from learning a truth it was completely unprepared to hear. And somewhere inside that quiet house, time continued moving forward, minute by minute, without mercy, without warning. By sunrise, everything would be different. The woman whose image had come to define an era would become part of history. But before the headlines, before the investigations, before the endless public debate, there was one final night. A night that ended in silence, and a morning that would change Hollywood forever. In the final chapter, we follow the documented events of that Sunday morning, the discovery inside the Brentwood house, the official investigation, and why Marilyn Monroe's final hours continue to fascinate the world more than 6 decades later. There are mornings that begin like every other. And then, there are mornings that divide history into before and after. Sunday, August 5th, 1962. The California sun rose over Los Angeles exactly as it always had. Golden light spilled across quiet streets. Birds began to sing. Neighbors started another ordinary day. But behind the walls of a small house on 5th Helena Drive, something was terribly wrong. Inside the home, Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, became concerned after noticing that Marilyn's bedroom door remained locked. The lights were still on. She could not get a response. According to the documented accounts, Dr. Ralph Greenson was contacted. Unable to reach Marilyn through the locked door, they eventually looked inside. What they saw would change Hollywood forever. Marilyn Monroe was found unresponsive in her bedroom. She was 36 years old. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was no longer quiet. Police officers arrived. Investigators entered the home. The peaceful street that had gone unnoticed only hours earlier suddenly became the center of the world's attention. Word spread with astonishing speed, first through police radios, then through local newsrooms, then across America. Before the day was over, the entire world knew. Marilyn Monroe was dead. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Newspapers rushed to print extra editions. Television broadcasters abandoned scheduled reports. Outside Marilyn's home, photographers gathered behind police lines. Fans arrived carrying flowers. Some stood in complete silence. Others cried openly. Many simply refused to believe it. How could someone who seemed larger than life disappear overnight? The official investigation concluded that Marilyn Monroe died from acute barbiturate poisoning, and her death was ruled a probable suicide. That official finding remains the legal conclusion of the case. Yet history rarely leaves behind simple endings. Over the decades, countless books, documentaries, and articles have revisited Marilyn's final hours. Questions have been raised. Different theories have been proposed. Some have attracted enormous public attention. Others have later been challenged or rejected. But despite decades of investigation and debate, some questions continue to be discussed even today, and perhaps they always will. Because when someone becomes larger than life, people often struggle to accept that their story could end in such an ordinary room, without a movie set, without applause, without a final curtain call. But maybe that is exactly why Marilyn Monroe's story continues to matter. Not because of the mystery, but because of the humanity. People remember the photographs, the white dress blowing above the subway grate, the unforgettable smile, the glamorous premieres, the flashing cameras. Those images became immortal. Yet behind every photograph stood a woman whose greatest dreams were surprisingly simple: to be understood, to be loved, to find peace. Fame gave Marilyn Monroe almost everything the world could offer: recognition, success, wealth, admiration. But fame could not rewrite her childhood. It could not erase loneliness. It could not guarantee happiness. That may be the most enduring lesson of her life. The brightest spotlight can illuminate a stage, while leaving the person standing beneath it
completely alone. More than 60 years have passed since that Sunday morning. Hollywood has changed. Generations of actors have come and gone. Entire studios have risen and disappeared. But Marilyn Monroe remains. Not only because of the films she made, not only because of the photographs that still fill museums and magazine covers, but because her story reminds us that behind every legend, there is a human being. A person whose fears are real, whose hopes are real, whose struggles are real.
Perhaps that is why millions of people continue searching for answers. Not simply to understand how Marilyn Monroe died, but to understand how Norma Jean lived. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy was never the loss of a Hollywood icon. It was the loss of a woman who spent her life searching for the peace she hoped she would one day find. And that is how the story of Marilyn Monroe truly ends. Not with a headline, not with a mystery, but with a reminder. Sometimes the world falls in love with a legend without ever truly seeing the person behind the smile.